And if we're talking about what we can do in this country, that's one of the main things we should be talking about.
I go back to my term uphill struggle, Rupert. What you said is idyllic, and it sounds a wonderful idea, and actually getting it into existence is the problem, isn't it? I think it's a major, major problem of being able to implement all things you talked about.
We should support people who are doing it in practical terms. We should put more research money into it, as I said, and we should work to change the politics.
Let's drop the bomb into this. I go along with a lot of what Rupert's saying. I think we can actually produce a lot more varied and resilient and sovereign, all those things. The one area that I do find difficulty with is the antipathy towards genetically modified organisms in that process. Because as far as I can see, is genetically modified organisms are organic. They are part.
Absolutely, and that is the
travesty of the debate at the moment is why we're not having the debate that how GM could be helping the organic.
Absolutely.
And if we could grow pineapples in Preston and grapefruit in Glasgow and stuff like that, and we use GM to do that without pesticides, I think that'd be fabulous. I'm on the board of Pesticide Action Network, and I'm having a row inside there because they're sort of all anti-GM, and I'm saying, well, no, we should have two positions. We should be against that GM which is encouraging the use of pesticides, and for that GM which is mitigating the use of pesticides. That would be the sensible position to have, but I'm losing that battle.
The potential for genetic modification to make cultivation greener is absolutely enormous, and it's a tragedy that the organic movement decided, and I think for highly suspect reasons, back in the early 2000s, they decided that it couldn't be, that GM could not be organic, because it's exactly the same as a conventionally bred crop.
Well, look, in principle, I think the idea of GM foods, which reduce the requirement for pesticides, is a good one, and I would welcome it in principle. But here's the rub, right? I take as a philosopher, not just as someone who's in politics, I take a fundamentally precautionary attitude to these things. And it seems to me that the grave danger of GM technology is that it's very difficult to see how you can introduce any GM technologies in a way that is consistent with the precautionary principle. So let's compare for a moment with medicine, for example. So say you're introducing some radical new medical technology that involves giving people drugs or something. There's various things that you can do to limit the potential negative impact of it. So, for example, you have a small number of volunteers who undertake to have a human trial of the thing, and if it goes at the last stage, and if it goes totally wrong at that stage, well, at the worst, you've killed a few people, and that's it, right? It's pretty bad, but that's it. It's contained. Principle. Well, what I'm saying is, it can't get out of control, right? And the problem with GM food is, how can you have a genuine experiment to test whether GM is going to work or not that can't get out of control? If you were actually going to do this in a proper, serious way, what you would have to do is something like this. You would have to somehow have some kind of barrier that could sequestrate some huge portion of the countryside from the entirety of the rest of the world, and test whether in that area, over generations, what happened was not fundamentally harmful to the environment, to biodiversity, to human health, etc.
Why, Rupert, does it have to be a huge area? Why can't you?
Well, because the point is that
it's a huge area.
It's called 100 million hectares across the world.
But
I know, and it's totally unprecautionary. We are gambling. We are gambling with our future across the world. You guys have it's done, but you guys have no idea. Can I just finish? You guys have no idea what an experiment you've unleashed and what the consequences of it could be. You've got no idea what the impact's going to be 50 years down the line.
Yeah, we have
biodiversity. You don't. You have absolutely no idea.
Right, let's have a go at that. Firstly, the precautionary principle. 10 years ago, when GM was sort of well on the horizon, no, maybe nearly 20 years ago, when GM was coming in, I was thinking, what the heck's this going on? I come from a pesticide background. I'm thinking we should be just holding on here. So when the idea of a precautionary principle came along, I was part of that. Right. Although, I have to say, the precautionary principle was brought in for something else. Precautionary principle was brought in for how to deal with hazards like asbestos.
No, the precautionary principle is a completely general principle.
Yes, it is, but it was brought in for that. In climate change, in other words, that we didn't wait for all the science to stack up before we acted, right? So the precautionary principle was then brought in for GM, although it seemed to be back to front. You actually, but as I say, I agreed with it. I sort of put in my sort of mind that we need to test this against the environment, against health and safety. So 10 years after it had been released into the world, over 100 million hectares, I decided to carry out, in my mind, a health, safety and environmental check. And to be quite honest, on health, I could find nothing. This is 100 million hectares of it grown. Safety, nothing. And I come from a background which is about hazards and what have you. And the first day that trains came into being, somebody was killed. There are 40 or 50 people killed on farms in Britain.
But it can't go out of control. That's the difference.
There's their own tractors, their roll bars.
No.
You
just don't know what's going to happen.
You just don't know what's going to happen. But in 10 years, I've looked, and we can set.
That's just 10 years.
Well, it's a heck of a long time.
It's a microscopic drop in the ocean on a biological timescale.
Other technologies, and other technologies by this time, pesticides would have kicked out a few deaths. Trains had certainly killed a lot of people, cars had. What we've got now at the moment is no ill health. Not a single person has been made ill by eating GM food. There's not a single accident caused by GM food. And the environmental consequences, there's two main ones. One is the resistant weeds from Roundup, and one is the more predators in China with the BT insecticide. So, evenly balanced, So, but those are totally natural.
The superweeds could be a very, very severe problem.
They will be. They will be. But that's normal and natural.
You can always control the superweeds by spraying with another herbicide. It isn't.
And it's like any change we make is bound to have consequences. And when I look at those, I think those are perfectly natural, almost predictable consequences, which our brains will have to keep working at.
You see, I take a fundamentally precautionary attitude. We shouldn't have introduced all those pesticides. We shouldn't have introduced all those pesticides. That was totally unprecautionary. So introducing railways is different. It's not comparable.
Okay.
Oh, excuse me. Why is the technology?
I have to say that GM and release of GM. You talk about the precautionary principle and the way that drugs are made. Most drugs are produced from genetically modified organisms. I'm a type 1 diabetic. I've been taking human insulin, which is genetically modified. It's produced in bacteria, and I've been taking it for 20 years.
Well, you look well on it.
I don't look at it. Some people say, "Oh well, we can see what the dangerous thing is." But the precautionary principle has been tried on genetic modification has been tried to death.
No, I don't accept that. I'm sorry.
It's exactly the same in bacteria.
The analogy for releasing the release that we've done already, and we shouldn't do more, or we should do less. The release that we've done already of GMOs into our ecosystems is comparable to dumping vast quantities of drugs into the water supply. That would be the analogy, not you taking some GM drugs, just dumping drugs en masse into the water supply.
These are natural organisms with a tweak of a gene.
These are genes that are integrated into the DNA of the plants. It's not dropping drug.
You digest it in 2 hours and you decompost in 2 months.
Rupert,
there's no trail.
I can just see you guys arguing for the introduction of pesticides and saying, everything's going to be fine.
I fought against them all my blinking life, haven't I?
Well, sorry, perhaps Cathie then, not you, Jane.
Not me
Most
at all.
scientists don't like
I'm very
lots of
keen
pesticides.
to reduce the use of pesticides.
Yeah, I know, but when they were brought in at the time, everyone was saying this is progress, it's going to be fine.
So
you just said that I'm just the same as when they were brought in?
No, I'm saying is you're being a Pollyanna about this new technology, and you're not taking seriously the precautionary arguments, which there were quite a long time. No, excuse me, it was quite a long time before Rachel Carson came along and started changing everybody's minds. If you look back at what people were saying in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they were all saying this is going to be fine. We've tested it. There's not going to be any problems. Right?
That wasn't our generation.
Well, I'm not talking about you, Charlie. I'm talking about scientists at the time.
I think a lot of scientists feel the same. They don't like the idea of lots of pesticides.
Well, I know you can say that now, but that's because you know what the hazards are. By the time you know what the hazards are from GM, it'll be too late.
No.
Do you know, somebody told me that a potato crop sometimes has 18 spray applications.
It's continuous.
Yes,
absolutely.
From the start.
That's why we should not go for GM and we should not go for pesticides. We need to look for genuine alternatives. That's why I'm talking about permaculture, organic, agroforestry, etc.
I love it, but I can't see why GM can't help develop that lot.
I'd be happy for it to do if it could be done in a genuinely precautionary way.
And I think the difference is,
becoming
as it comes out the corporate, I think the debate about GM will move on at some point, is that the technology has changed in the sense that 10 years ago, it was in the corporate hands what GM was about. It's now in the public hands. And I think we have to have a really interesting debate in the public sector about what the public sector can do versus the private.
How we can do things for the public.
That's why I say I
genetic
cry out that our public sector has declined so much, because we want a lot more of that, so we can have that debate
Charles,
much better.
They do try and have debates on this topic. I mean, and unfortunately, they break up. I mean, some years ago, they had trouble galore, didn't they, at meetings, and they had a protest in Norwich. Do you remember? A crop was damaged.
Absolutely, I remember very well. Some of my best friends were on the protest.
And if you and I disagree about something, I think that's fine. We should meet and discuss it, have an intelligent conversation, get some intelligent advice, but not protest and make a lot of fuss and damage crops and things.
Well, hang on a minute. When people are doing something potentially dangerous, it's entirely appropriate. Yes, it was a trial, but it's an uncontrolled trial. What I'm saying is, if you were going to have a genuine trial of GM ever, you would have to, in a way that was genuinely proportionary, you would have to stop any kind of drift of pollen or what have you from outside that area from happening. How could they possibly do that? You can't do it with GM technology.
Brought up and loves the organic aspect of it. I was horrified when the organic farmer tried to trash the crop at Rothamsted. Okay. The idea of somebody who's organic trashing plants is a contradiction in my head.
Not really, not when the plants are trashing themselves.
I remember it's like Kinnock said about the Liverpool so-called socialists dishing out redundancy notices to people. To my mind, organics trashing growing plants. I thought, what are they doing?
Rupert, if you haven't tried to understand why they were interested in trashing those plants, you haven't thought very deeply about the situation.
I don't think they thought very deeply. That's what I would.
The question you ought to be asking is, why hasn't the conversation about GM been a better and deeper one? And I think the real answer is twofold. Firstly, I agree with you that too much of the argument from the pro-GM side has been captured by corporations, and it would be better to do it in a way through that
like
was
us,
more.
Actually.